During our class videos, you may hear our poets and playwrights use terms that are new to you. We have created a list of key terms and definitions that you can refer to at any point during our video lectures. This list is available on the Videos and Readings class page, where you can read it or download it as a PDF. If you would like to find and review these terms while you watch each class video, you can stop this video, go back to the Videos and Readings class page, and download the PDF. There you can play this video and each of the following class videos. If you have any questions about these terms, we encourage you to ask your teaching team in the weekly class discussions. Prageeta Sharma is the author of Bliss to Fill, The Opening Question, Infamous Landscapes, and Undergloom. She is a recipient of the 2010 Howard Foundation Grant, and she is taught at the University of Iowa and the University of Missouri.
Hi, my name is Prageeta Sharma, and I am going to just read to you a modification of an essay I wrote for the poet Joshua Marie Wilkinson's book on pedagogy and teaching. And I'm hoping that this essay will easily convert to a webinar and that my audience will be able to engage in how we conduct a virtual workshop that connects our creative self to a variety of experiences related to our diverse identities, which could be understood to be loosely shaped around themes that affect us and form our experiences: economics, poverty, age, race, culture, gender, sexuality, and disability, and thus to explore the idea of social practice in poetry. Social practice is an art medium that focuses on social engagement, inviting collaboration with individuals, communities, and institutions in the creation of participatory art. In this case, we are talking about poetry and the idea of defining the varieties of communities we participate in and generate work out of. Often and historically, we're in spaces that don't always acknowledge the oppressions we face and that shape the content and style of our work. My particular focus today will be around gender and race, and then other ideas as well, and the writing practice as it relates to an understanding of certain selves and the theme of privilege that might inform some writing practices. The biggest pedagogical takeaway from this talk is how exploratory we can be. How can we convert some of my questions, which I'll get to at the end of this, into prompts for you to think about with your own work, and also move away from judging our work based on very biased ways of workshop exchange among students. And I will start with personal stories around my teaching practice and my experiences in the classroom. Entering the classroom, I'm a short, 4'10" South Asian woman. I'm a child of immigrants, a first-generation American. But I'm also a poet, a calling that has given me a voice and the opportunity for a kind of freedom that would not otherwise be possible. Sometimes as a teacher, I'm forced to conflate both identities, and thus I am and have always been set on empowering and supporting both the study of poetry and the power for students of poetry to transform their own histories, identities, and difficulties into forms of resilience. Because of who I am and what I look like, I have often found myself, over the years, attuned to difference, bias, and racism in the classroom. In response, I have thought a lot about ways to not perpetuate cultural hierarchies in the workshop setting in order to have some practical pedagogical models to connect to the act of creative writing. A writing practice inherently caught up in voice, perspective, stamina, perseverance, and sometimes talent. Race and culture come up directly in the workshop setting, and also in a lot of writing settings in our community settings, but often in odd and seemingly innocuous ways. I had a student once comment, "We're all white here." No, indeed we're not. I'm not, and there was also another student who appeared white, but who was not. Another student said to me affectionately, "I don't think about your ethnicity." I thought to myself, I know. I know the student didn't intend this comment as a kind of erasure. Neither student understood that their whiteness historically positions them to tell others what they are and are not. I can also recall a class where the students earnestly said, "Isn't it better that we couldn't identify the poet as black?" The notion that it was a good thing that this poet was being read outside of his, in this case it was a he, race, that he was therefore not limited to being defined in terms of race, and consequently more accessible, does not sit well with me. What is at the heart of this tendency to universalize, and from poets who should know better than to universalize? Could this desire to move beyond race be an unconscious effort to keep it at a distance? And could this mark a disengagement because there is no personal connection? In fact, I often find such a lack of personal connection to race and culture arising indirectly in a workshop setting, and also in many settings in the classroom, in the guise of disinterest, as in, this poem was not interesting to me, or I can't relate to it, so I'm not sure how to respond. When the poem being read or workshopped is intact and does not exhibit any unintentional grammatical errors of any sort, but is, to some degree, exhibiting the imaginative and experiential space of the student, it is often at this point a place to reckon with the content. The poem enacts or is trying to do something unknown. It does not constitute a readily shared personal or literary experience. When the student reading the poem cannot put certain cultural symbols in place as signposts, the poem becomes unrecognizable in their peer's sense of the world or the reader's sense of the world. Responses are guarded, with students unwilling to explore what at the first or a second reading makes the poem unknown or disengaging. While this also happens when teaching established poets in the classroom setting, then the students do have an innate sense of the authority of the poet being taught. But this is not necessarily the case for peer critique and response in the workshop environment, nor I think online as well and in forums and when we're sharing poems. Expectation and as in tokenism or reductive representations of identity, which I don't need to necessarily talk about here right now, also inhibits engagement. Expectations and a willingness to engage in someone else's identity are important for an individual to deepen her understanding of her own identity. More so than ever, poets are consciously and unconsciously connecting their aesthetics to ideas about their environment, socialization, and identity. Discussions about aesthetic range and inclusion are particularly valuable when students are able to discern the motivation behind what their tastes look like in relation to their schooling or aesthetic bents. It is important to think about classroom pedagogy in relation to aesthetics so that false hierarchies are not made to disengage students from their ideas about aesthetics or poetry. And I guess I could say that a lot of times when we talk about poetry, we talk about what we like and what we don't like. But it's really interesting to figure out what shapes that idea of liking, and can we get beyond liking and disliking. Really, that's my point. Furthermore, I think it's important to establish a set of outcomes for students as well, that they don't seek to dismiss each other out of a kind of intolerance of cultural diversity in the name of aesthetic diversity. I've seen workshops divide around aesthetic biases, and I've also seen them come together because of them too. I can get more concrete here. When bias in the classroom arises, I try to use the workshop as a place to explore ways that we as poets and thinkers are inclusive, as a way of forming our styles, nurturing our voices, and also exclusionary, as a way of protecting ourselves from what is unknown and potentially threatening. Because what I've found is that students need to say something about where they come from and who they are. It is damaging to their psyche when they cannot. Oftentimes, it is the individuals in the group who do not find a way to represent their cultural places, to talk about how it informs their aesthetic. And if a majority of the group is privileged in some way, those outside the majority may not be granted a certain essential credence to the direction of their art. Which leads me to strategies in the workshop. Some years after I was teaching, I encountered Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. In it, she creates a list of biases based on the daily effects of white privilege in order to discuss the kinds of invisible forms of dominance play out in academic environments. I would also say that we have them in virtual environments too, and in the media. Here are some examples from McIntosh's article. She has a list of advantages and disadvantages. 1, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. 2, I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. 3, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and which I would want to live. 4, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. 5, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. 6, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. 7, when I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I'm shown that people of my color made it what it is. And then the list goes on. But we, like McIntosh, are able to create a list of the kind of biases we bring to the classroom based on our perceived notions of race, class, and gender, etc., in relation to aesthetic. I've seen McIntosh's list work successfully in a variety of academic settings and in community meetings to improve understanding of our cultural differences. I'm just starting to explore this approach in the classroom by brainstorming a list of daily effects and also prompts for my students in order that we can explore what in their content and their form relates back to particular socializations, biases, or even a positive or negative resistance to their own socialization. I'm also finding that it can serve to combat what we have all observed as the all too common phenomenon of dismissal and disinterest among students in a workshop setting. I would also say virtually too. And in doing so, it can create a forum in the workshop to discuss aesthetic and intention in relation to our own experience of race, class, gender, ableness, sexuality, age, etc., in order to immerse ourselves within it, enjoy it, or redefine it if we so wish. And for example, what are some models we can generate for ourselves that are our own list of questions that, that are prompts? Can I write a poem? And I just took McIntosh's lines and I tried to convert them into prompts. Can I write a poem about what it means to be able to arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time? What would this poem look like? What would it say about white supremacy and cultural practices around me? 2, can I write a poem about someone who avoids spending time with people whom they are trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me? 3, do I write about poems that explore my obstacles or my advantages, such as if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing a housing in an area which I can afford and which I would want to live? Even thinking of poems that represent aspirations and goals and dreams, it's a kind of privilege. And we can talk about even poets from the canon whose subject matter signals a kind of privilege and a kind of themes of leisure. I can write a chronicle of what it's like for my body, shape, size, and gender and identity to do something mundane, like go shopping alone most of the time, and know that I might be followed or harassed. 5, when I turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race represented, what does this representation look like? What kind of poem can I write from that experience? Can I write a prose poem, for example, about how the media tells me about our national heritage or about civilization? Am I shown that people of my color made it what it is? Or is it some other group of people? Will my prose poem explore my feelings? Ultimately, I wanted to think about what kind of social practice could we have in a forum like this, where we start to look at how poems can allow ourselves to connect to different communities. What does our vernacular or writing styles look like? What 20th century literary traditions come out of it? I can even encourage you to think about imitation of a certain kind of poem that you think resonates with your vernacular. Can I translate another vernacular to my own? For example, taking Shakespeare, writing a sonnet, but then taking it back to my community and my community's vernacular. So I tend to think about prompts that allow community building too. Can I have a friend tell me a story and I interpret it as best as I can in the form of a long poem? And then can I try to use her dialogue or his dialogue and testimony, and when I'm finished, read it back to them and have them further collaborate with me? These are the exercises that I think can come out of a social practice, but also change the way we talk about a poem. We get out of the binary of good or bad, and we start thinking about how the poem itself is a social practice. In thinking about how I can use Peggy McIntosh's example of advantages and disadvantages and the list that she forms, and to think of how I as a poet and my students can interact with that, is to think about a list of questions or concerns. Actually, even the form of the list poem does this, where a poet can list their own sets of advantages and disadvantages that are very particular to their experience, so that they are listing inequities that are daily occurrences, for example, and that from that list we get a sense of the voice of a poet's experience of inequity or oppression or privilege. Well, I think back to a poet like Joe Brainerd, who wrote I Remember in the 70s. And when we have the listing of I Remember, he starts from childhood memories, and we end up building and accumulating these sensorial experiences, as well as events that happen to him that explore his queerness, his otherness, his ideas of alterity, and how he is experienced by his list of what he remembers. And it's an aphora, and it starts with I remember, I remember, I remember. And that is one way to think about Peggy McIntosh, but also think about the poetic form of repetition. I think, or what I've noticed in looking at modernism to the current day, if we look at poets like Gertrude Stein, for example, or if we look at beat poets like Ginsberg, and I would say he sort of is in many different categories. If I look at the Black Arts movement and I think about Amiri Baraka, if I think about Audre Lorde's work, I do see the I speaking to the world, sometimes in repetition, sometimes the language returns constantly back to its subject in order to work out ideas of emphasis around advantages and disadvantages. But it's interesting to think about movements, literary movements that are on the edges, that use repetition as a form of both protest and as emphasis. So they do explicitly and implicitly articulate who's in the center and who's around the center.